This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
So today for our guest, we have Loyd Grossman, who is the author of The Artist and the Eternal City, Bernini, Pope Alexander the VII, and the Making of Rome. Loyd is an author, broadcaster, entrepreneur, and he was a longtime host of the television program MasterChef in the UK. And what I loved is that you dive into subjects that are fascinating to me. You could talk about history, art history, urban planning, and so much more. So I just want to thank you so much for joining us today about the papacy and art history.
Yeah, it's kind of a journey into a very strange world, because what particularly fascinates me about the 17th century and about 17th century Rome in particular is the fact that it's kind of close enough in time to be recognizably modern, yet it's far enough away to be really weird and fascinating. So there are elements of the 17th century that seem very familiar to us. And there are many other elements of the 17th century that seem so strange and intriguing. So it's a period that I've really enjoyed getting to know that period.
Rome is one of those places, I think it's unique in Europe and even in the world, that it's so much history piled on top of history, and different styles. And I think you get into that in the book, or you lay that out for us. And I thought there was a unique anecdote you said of your first time in Rome, and it sounded like a lot of my first time in Rome, that it was complete sensory overload. There's so much art, so much history, so much of everything. Maybe could you tell us a little bit about, I'd love to hear it directly from you, your experience of that first time in Rome.
Yeah, well, I think when I first visited Rome, I was pretty overwhelmed by it, because it's there's a lot of it. It's pretty big. It's very chaotic. It's very frenetic. It's very unlike a lot of the idyllic Italian towns and villages that we often think about when traveling. Rome is a big, sprawling, messy capital city. It's not pretty. It is beautiful. It's ravishingly beautiful, but it ain't pretty. It ain't picturesque. It's beautiful. And there's a big difference between pretty and beautiful. And so when I first came to Rome, I was a student, and my brother and I were sort of traveling around Europe with something called a Eurail pass, which just gave you unlimited train travel around Europe. And we were booked into a pensione, which is a very basic kind of bed and breakfast place in Rome. And as I was climbing up the stairs to check in, these stretcher bearers came past me carrying a dead body, and which I thought was a little bit much to take first thing in the morning. And when I went to check into my room, they said, "Oh, we just have to clean your room up. I'm afraid the previous occupant left rather suddenly." And I have to say, I wasn't really that encouraged by that. And I looked at my brother and said, something, this town ain't for us. We've got to get out of here. So on my very first visit to Rome, I only spent a day there. I didn't even sleep over. But, and it took me some years, I think it was about 15 years later, that I went back to Rome, having spent a lot of time in Italy and traveled to Italy, 5, 6, 7, 8 times a year. It was only about probably 20 years after my first visit that I went back to Rome, and then I totally fell in love with the place.
The main setting of this is the Baroque period. What is Baroque art? It's one of those things that's big. It's kind of, for lack of a better word, messy. There's a lot going on. What is Baroque art?
Yeah. Well, you say tomato, I say tomato, and Baroque Baroque and roll, as we call it, because it really is. It's easier to describe probably with a musical analogy, because it's very hard to define. It's very, very hard to define. As a musical analogy, I would say it's Baroque is when you can play the melody, but you decide to improvise instead. And it's kind of more like Miles Davis than it is like Beethoven. It's quite sort of jazzy. It's very free form. It's very emotional. It's very expressive. And it comes between two periods of art, the Renaissance period and the neoclassical period, both periods where art was governed by fairly comprehensive and comprehensible sets of rules. You know, there was a way, if you wanted to design a Renaissance palace, there was a way to do it. If you wanted to design a neoclassical building, there was a way to do it. There were rules about proportions to be followed and so on. And Baroque is like this crazy hallucinogenic interval between these two very rational types of architecture. One of the Italian critics said that Baroque is when instead of drawing a straight line, you draw lots of curlicues and wavy lines. So it's this very emotional, expressive, inventive, free-form style of art and architecture, which became very much the house style of the 17th century papacy, and also of autocratic rulers in the 17th century, like Louis XIV. So it was much more popular in continental Europe than it ever was in England and in Britain and in the English-speaking world. So both the British and Americans have always been a little bit suspicious of Baroque, because Baroque was very, very, very associated both with Catholicism, which of course was anathema to the British establishment, and also with authoritarian autocratic rule, which was also anathema to the British progressive establishment. So, but Baroque is something that a lot of people in the English-speaking world are not so familiar with. And it's one of the most enchanting and fascinating periods to me in the whole history of art.
Who were some of the big names? We'll eventually get into Bernini, but who were some of the other people who really made that style?
Well, there were, I mean, it's fundamentally, it's very Italian. So you get, I mean, Bernini's great rival, the Swiss-born architect Borromini, is one of the great practitioners of the Baroque, and it's very widely disseminated throughout Italy and southern Germany. You know, particularly the Catholic parts of Germany, because it's a style that's very much promoted by the church, and there are numerous practitioners. But what's particularly and of course in England you get a type of English Baroque which is much more restrained, and then you get some very famous names like Hawksmoor, for example, who was probably the greatest master of the English Baroque. But really, it's an incredibly widespread and widely practiced form of architecture. And it's very apparent to anyone who visits Italy, because the 17th century was a period of the extremely energetic church building and palace building. So an enormous amount of what you see when you visit Italy is Baroque architecture.
There's a bunch of big things going on in the 1600s politically that really determined how the papacy operated and how the entire, basically the European world, what was particularly the Treaty of Westphalia, what was going on at that time?
Well, it's a very confused time. to begin with, you have, I mean, the overwhelming fact of life in early 17th century Europe is the 30 Years' War. And the 30 Years' War goes on from 1618, so just before the Pilgrims set off. It goes on from 1618 to 1648. And it is ostensibly a continental-wide conflict between Catholic states and Protestant states, and Catholic rulers and Protestant rulers. And it's all about determining which faith these various nation states and duchies and principalities are going to follow. So it's a big tussle about whether we're going to be Protestant or we're going to be Catholic. In many ways, it is one of the first modern wars because it is a war that involves the civilian population. And the civilian casualties over the course of 30 years run into the millions. It is the biggest catastrophe to strike Europe between the time of the Black Death in the 1340s and the Great War in 1914. So you have 30 years of incredible savagery, suffering, plague, famine, destruction, pillaging, rape, and so on, just destroying Central Europe. In normal times, the Pope would be seen as the European peacemaker. But of course, we're in a period where the Protestant states just, look at papal authority and say, well, we're not having the Pope tell us what to do. We'll sort it out. And as a result of the declining moral and political authority of the Pope, because, of course, the Pope no longer has a monopoly on religion, as a result of his declining authority, the war drags on and on and on and on and on. And even when they decide to negotiate a peace treaty, it takes them 4 years to negotiate the peace treaty. And the peace treaty kind of ends with, it's kind of a marginal win for the Protestants and a marginal defeat for the Catholics, but a greater defeat for the power of the Catholic Church.
Yeah, that's as a matter of fact, there was a pope who would later become pope who was at that signing of the Treaty of Westphalia. Tell us a little bit about Alexander, the man who would become Alexander the VII.
Yeah. I mean, first, one's got to get one's head around the number of popes that there are, because generally, you didn't become a pope until you were quite elderly. So most popes had a fairly sort of short period in office, as it were. So you look at the 17th century and you see all these popes and you sort of think, it's rather like when you start reading a big Russian novel. There are all these characters and you think, I'm never going to remember who any of these people are. But eventually the ones that are important get sorted out from the ones that are less important. And one of the most important popes of the 17th century is this guy who is called Fabio Chigi. And of course, when he becomes pope, as with everyone else, when he becomes pope, he then has to assume a regnal name, and he becomes Pope Alexander the VII. But originally, he comes from a very prominent family because one of his collateral ancestors, Agostino Chigi, was the banker to a previous pope. And as the banker to a pope, amassed a huge fortune, which eventually declined. So Chigi is the descendant of a once hugely wealthy, hugely important family. So he has a lot of connections. They don't have any money anymore, but he's got a lot of connections. He's very clever. He's incredibly good at Latin. And, Latin was the language of diplomacy and the language of scholarship. He's a very good Latin poet. He goes and studies law, and he goes to work for the church. He's a very good diplomat. He eventually becomes the papal ambassador to, what is essentially Germany. And because of his role there, he's put in charge of trying to negotiate an end to the 30 Years' War, which he fails to do. But he comes back and, they say sort of nice try. And because you tried so hard, and basically no one could really have done it any more successfully, we're going to make you Secretary of State. So he becomes the papal Secretary of State. And then when the current Pope dies, Fabio Chigi is proposed as Pope. Papal elections were very highly contested because the great Catholic powers, namely France and Spain, they all wanted, the French wanted to have their favorite candidate as Pope, and the Spanish wanted their favorite candidate. And the various important families in Italy were negotiating amongst themselves. And eventually, Chigi is persuaded to put himself forward as a candidate, and much to his chagrin, because he didn't want to become Pope, he's elected Pope and he becomes Alexander the VII. And this is a pretty important moment in the history of Rome. This is 1655.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Why was that such a particularly important time, and what did Alexander the VII? He's a pretty old guy at this point. He's not in great health, but he really puts his stamp onto the city, and he's an active pope. What was going on with him?
Well, what he does is he's come back. He has spent years in Germany trying and failing to bring an end to the 30 Years' War. So he comes back to Rome slightly with his tail between his legs, and he becomes Pope at a time when the power of the Catholic Church is waning. And Alexander's genius is he invents, what we would now call soft power. He thinks, hang on, I don't have an army. I don't have the sort of political power that popes used to have. I don't really have the economic power anymore because Italy is slightly declining economically. So how can I enhance the prestige of the church? How can I make the church punch above its weight? How can I make the church seem more important than it really is in many ways? I know I will make Rome the cultural, artistic heart of Europe. I will turn this city into the city that everyone, whether they're Catholic, Protestant, or neither, I will turn this city into the must-see destination. I will make Rome again the center of Europe. And he does that by engaging upon a huge urban development project. And he takes it very seriously. He has a scale model of Rome put in his private apartments. Very unusually, he goes walking around the city. I mean, a pope does not walk around the city. A pope gets carried around a city or gets driven around a city. Not Alexander the VII. He goes walking around the city. And in his diary, he's endlessly writing, must do this, must rebuild that church, must widen that street, must build a monument here, must put a fountain there. He's like one of the great urban planners, and he does this in order to enhance the power and the glory of the papacy and the Catholic Church.
Is that something that was his own idea, or was that kind of an idea that was building at the time, that we're in rough shape here, let's recreate this city to make it the shining city on a hill?
Well, previous popes had done quite a lot of urban development in Rome because, every 50 years, there was a special holy year in Rome. And these holy years became so popular that they eventually started doing them every 25 years. And during a holy year, hundreds of thousands of pilgrims would be attracted to Rome. And this created enormous problems because there's this sudden influx of tourists arriving in a city, but it created enormous opportunities as well because the tourists were there to spend money, to make donations to the church, to stay in hotels, to use the local prostitutes, to go to the local bookshops, to go to the taverns, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a desire expressed by quite a few popes of we've got to improve the city to make it more hospitable, more efficient in terms of receiving these hundreds of thousands of visitors. So quite a few popes had done things aimed at making Rome a better city, a more attractive city. But Alexander the VII had a much more holistic view of the whole city, a much more intense focus on the city, and a much greater talent at really conceiving how great the city could be. So yeah, he had predecessors who had tried to do such things, but there was no one of his talent or imagination or drive to do it.
Was this just was he basically just dressing up the city, kind of putting a fresh coat of paint? Did he make any structural or infrastructure improvements to the city, kind of the more mundane stuff?
Yeah. I mean, there was always a big push, largely because of the number of pilgrims and then the number of carriages, because, we think that modern cities have big traffic problems. Well, in the early 17th century, Rome had a terrible traffic problem because of the number of carriages, horses and carriages and pedestrians. So there was a really important drive to improve the road system of Rome, to make the roads more rational, to create straighter, broader roads, to demolish things that got in the way of traffic, to build new churches, to build new fountains, to bring a better water supply to neighborhoods. So, yeah, there were real infrastructure improvements. It wasn't just cosmetic. There was a lot of building work. I mean, a huge amount of really serious building work. And a very large proportion of the Roman population worked in the building trade as a result of that. So it was a very much, like when America got itself out of the Great Depression through public works. It was very similar to that in 17th century Rome. How do we solve the problem of urban poverty? Well, we'll build a lot of buildings and employ these people to build the buildings. So there was a lot of profound improvement in the infrastructure of Rome, as well as in the beauty of Rome.
Getting into Bernini, and maybe we can talk a little bit about his background in this. Was Bernini Alexander's right-hand man in this project, or was he specifically brought on to work on a couple of key projects to really bring this whole idea of reimagining Rome back together?
Bernini was the indispensable right-hand man, partner, actually. I'd say partner, collaborator, rather than, because, while the Pope had all these great ideas, he didn't really know what to do. Bernini had extraordinary skill. He began as a sculptor, but as many others did in those days, he moved very quickly from sculpture into architecture. Bernini knew how to design buildings and he knew how to get them built. And Bernini's brother was an incredibly talented engineer, so he knew how to build buildings that didn't collapse. And Bernini provided the Pope with the artistic talent that the Pope required to realize his vision of Rome. So Bernini was indispensable to Alexander, and Alexander was indispensable to Bernini, because Alexander, who wielded the greatest amount of economic, financial, and political power in Rome, could make things happen. So it was a marriage made in heaven. It was one of the greatest artistic partnerships in history.
Somebody like Bernini, he's an artist. He's a painter. He's an architect.
Yeah.
He's a sculptor in bronze and in stone. Was this type of person, this Renaissance man, for a lack of a better word, was
Yeah.
he kind of the last generation of that type of person? Or were people starting to specialize more at this point?
Yeah, it was just that's such a fascinating question, Stephen, because it's just at the moment when the arts are becoming more professionalized and more specialized. So, for example, let's look at the greatest English architect, Christopher Wren. Fabulous architect, self-taught. I mean, basically, interested in astronomy, basically trained as a scientist, turns himself into the greatest ever English architect. Before Bernini, Michelangelo, who we think about mostly as a sculptor, is also a fabulous architect. And it's really not until about 100 years later, it's not until the middle of the 18th century that we start to have architects who become career architects, who train to be architects and practice as architects. Before then, we have sculptors who design buildings. We have painters who design buildings, and the arts are much more fluid, much more, as you say, what we would call in the realm of the Renaissance man. And, Bernini is visually so astute and technically so sophisticated that he's able to turn his hand at designing almost anything.
Who was his team? Because he's almost a project manager at this point, and has the vision. Who was his group of people who got these things actually done?
Well, Bernini, we have this myth, and it's largely due to the Impressionists. We think of because the Impressionists were so important to our understanding of what art is, we tend to think of artists as being these solitary individuals, these individual creators who do everything themselves, and they're usually starving and they only become famous after they die, all that sort of stuff, which is mostly not true in the history of art. Bernini was immensely successful, both artistically and financially. And he had a huge team of people working for him, because that's how the arts worked in those days. For example, you look at an artist like, two of the other most successful artists of the period, people like Rubens or Van Dyck, they had huge teams of people working for them. So Bernini at one stage employed almost every well-known sculptor in Rome worked for Bernini, because Bernini had a huge amount of work to do, all sorts of different commissions. He was the mastermind. He was the designer. He was the creator. He was the controller, but he did not personally put his chisel to every bit of marble that was sculpted by his studio. It was a team. And, no more, one doesn't expect an architect to actually lay the bricks. Bernini was coming up with those ideas, wonderful ideas, doing the drawings, supervising everything, et cetera, and he had a huge team.
How did Bernini, this is a subjective question, but in your opinion, how does he rate amongst a time period where there's many, many great artists in Europe? How do you think that, and especially in this Baroque style, how does he rate?
Yeah, well, look, it's a period of great artists, because if you think about Bernini's contemporaries, just a few of them, Rembrandt, Velázquez, Caravaggio, some of the biggest names in the whole history of art. And it's not really either feasible or fair to say, well, actually, I think Bernini was greater than Rembrandt or Rembrandt was greater than Caravaggio. You can't really say that. But in his lifetime and in their lifetimes in the 17th century, Bernini was regarded as, without doubt, the greatest living artist in Europe. So the judgment of his contemporaries was that he was the best that there was.
Maybe let's take a look at a couple of his individual pieces, and especially some of the individual things that he worked on with Alexander. What maybe is one, and say just the rebuilding of Rome. What was one of the projects that really stands out for you?
I think the most incredible project is the design of St. Peter's Square, because St. Peter's is the most important church of the Catholic world. And there it is, in the center of, what is now Vatican City. St. Peter's is the great church, the greatest church, but it was not in a great setting. So it was decided, and popes had thought about it for years, there was a need to create a great square in front of St. Peter's. And it was Alexander the VII who commissioned Bernini to actually get this done. And Bernini came up with an amazing design. And with these, a square, a lot of people say it's an oval. It's not actually an oval. It's a rectangle with two half circles on either end. Bernini came up with this great shape of the square, surrounded by these amazing colonnades. And he said that he wanted the colonnades to represent the embracing arms of the church, the way the church welcomed those of faith, and also wanted to gather in those with no faith. And he created this huge square in front of St. Peter's to accommodate the enormous crowds that would come to listen to the Pope on certain key days. And it remains one of the greatest urban spaces in the world. And it's a place where, you go and you stand in St. Peter's Square, and you don't have to be Catholic. You don't have to have any religion at all. It's impossible to stand in that space without feeling transcendental and inspired and spiritualized. And that is, probably the single most important urban space in Rome, and one of the greatest city spaces in the world.
What were some of the challenges that Bernini had in creating this square to meet his view of what he wanted it to be?
Well, as always, money. Money is, I think, money has been the bane of architects ever since time began. And, and the papacy was not really bringing in the money that it used to. But Alexander the VII, as a very profligate developer of Rome, Alexander was spending very, very freely, and the cupboard was getting pretty bare. So Bernini had to do this great project, but he always had cost in mind. So instead of, the colonnades of St. Peter's are, instead of being made out of marble, they're made out of travertine, which is a cheaper, easier to carve stone, so it could be done more cheaply and more quickly. There were practical considerations, because he was never really, even for his most important works, he was never given a totally blank check. And Alexander the VII was always worried about money. And the people of Rome were not that thrilled, because they were saying that, hang on, all this money is being spent on these grand building projects, but we need to be looked after. So there was a great deal of popular discontent about these huge papal building projects because they were regarded as trophy projects, which actually weren't doing anything for the common people of Rome. That was a prevailing thought at the time.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. But in a way, though, couldn't you say that those trophy projects were kind of the thing that we're going to bring these people in on the Jubilee years to spend money to, I mean, almost like building a new convention center in town?
Yeah, totally. Look, it's exactly the same thing that happens now because you want to build a new convention center in town. The first thing that people say is, well, why are we investing $500 million building a convention center when we still have food banks? You know, that's one of the classic dilemmas of urban development is, you know, you want to build a huge infrastructure project, but how do you justify the amount of money that is going to take? And, you know, whereas nowadays there are all sorts of fancy ways to look at the sort of cost benefits of such projects. In the 17th century, that didn't exist. You know, the Pope said, I want a new square, and that's that. But, you know, there was a lot of popular discontent, and unsurprisingly, a lot of people were unable to take the long view. They didn't think, oh, well, this will be great because 25 years from now we'll have more pilgrims. They just thought, actually, we'd like the money now. And a previous pope, I mean, the wonderfully named Pope Innocent X, for example, who built the most beautiful fountain in Rome, the Fountain of the Four Rivers, he unveiled this huge fountain. And it created a popular chant. The people were chanting "Pane, pane, non fontane," which was bread, bread, not fountains. So, you know, the conflict between urban beautification and urban aggrandizement and meeting the needs of the common people is one of the oldest conflicts in the book.
What was Bernini's personality? Was he, I mean, I would have to imagine somebody like that would have a pretty strong personality.
Yeah. He was arrogant. He was self-loving. He was very egotistical, very, very egotistical. He was selfish. You know, and sort of arrogance and egotism and selfishness, you know, quite often the greatest artists are like that because it's a pretty cutthroat world out there. And the world of the 17th century was even more cutthroat. You know, there was no safety net. Bernini, you know, came out of, I mean, his grandfather was a peasant, was a very minor league peasant shoemaker in the Tuscan countryside. And, you know, his father was a moderately successful sculptor, but not a bigwig. And, you know, Bernini was very determined to be rich and to be famous and to hang around with the rich and famous. So, you know, in order to do that, it took, you know, a lot of aggression, a lot of self-belief. You know, it was a pretty tough old world.
One of the other major things that one of the stamps that got really put onto Rome in this time, and it makes Rome unique in the world, is the sheer number of obelisks around the city. What was the fascination of Rome with obelisks?
Yeah, I know. It's kind of amazing because, you know, Rome, there are 13 obelisks in Rome. So there are more obelisks in Rome than there are in Egypt. And of course, they originated in Egypt, and no one knows really why they were built in the first place, but they did have something to do with the worship of the sun god. At any rate, and they're one of the distinguishing factors of ancient Egypt. You know, you think about ancient Egypt, you think about pyramids, the Sphinx, and these obelisks. So when Rome conquered Egypt in 30 BC. And this was a very big deal. And the conquest of Egypt was led by Julius Caesar's nephew, Octavian, who subsequently became the Emperor Augustus. It was very important for Rome to conquer Egypt because Egypt became known as the granary of the empire. It was an incredibly prolific source of wheat. And the Italian peninsula, where Rome is, needed to be fed. The population of Rome needed to be fed. So Egypt was incredibly important for the food supply of Rome. And geopolitically, control of Egypt also sealed your control of the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean. So the Roman conquest of Egypt in 30 BC was a huge game changer. Also, psychologically and politically, it marked the point when Rome said, we are now the most important civilization in the world. Because for thousands of years, Egypt has been the dominant civilization. It is the oldest civilization in the world. And you know something? We've gone in there, we've taken it over, and we've superseded them. And in order to commemorate this, Augustus, wanted to bring a few souvenirs home. So he began transporting obelisks to Rome as a mark of the fact that the Roman Empire had now superseded Egypt as the world's dominant civilization. And emperors who followed Augustus carried on the custom of plundering obelisks from Egypt and bringing them back to Rome. And whilst this seems like a bit of ancient one-upsmanship, which it is, it was also something that, in modern times, obelisks had incredible symbolic value. In the late 19th century, there was a huge movement to bring an obelisk to New York. And one of the New York papers said, we will never be a world city until we have our own obelisk, because Rome has an obelisk, Berlin has an obelisk, London has an obelisk, Paris has an obelisk, New York must have an obelisk. And they brought one back. It's in Central Park. So, there is something highly charged emotionally and symbolically and spiritually about obelisks. And Rome's got more of them than any place in the world, 13 obelisks.
The obelisks, didn't they kind of become marker points throughout the city as well?
Yeah, they were. Originally what the Romans did was the Romans tended to put them in their sort of sports stadiums where chariot races were, and also put them in front of temples and mausoleums and that sort of stuff. And with the fall of Rome, the obelisks began to fall as well, because Rome became pretty decrepit. And it was only in the Renaissance that the popes, particularly the very sort of comically named Pope Sixtus V, decided that obelisks would be incredibly useful as signposts. So you put a huge obelisk in front of one of the pilgrimage churches of Rome, and from a great distance, visitors, tourists, could say, oh, look, there's an obelisk. That must be the church of so-and-so that I need to get through. So the obelisks became like these punctuation marks or signposts in Rome as a way of guiding people around from one important church to another. So it was a very clever use of obelisks, and also amazing feat of engineering to be able to re-erect these obelisks, some of which weigh over 100 tons. And to get them re-erected was quite extraordinary. It was one of the sort of wonders of 16th and 17th century engineering, was putting these obelisks back up again. So ever since the popes decided to use the obelisks as street signs in Rome, they've been very identified with Rome. Rome is a city of obelisks.
And they just didn't throw them back up. They really repurposed them, these obelisks, in many ways. And one of the more famous ones that was repurposed was Bernini repurposed an obelisk. What did he do with the obelisk?
Well, what Bernini did, Bernini was every time an obelisk was discovered, because of course they, over the period of the ruination of Rome, they got buried under rubbish, et cetera, et cetera. And every time an obelisk was rediscovered, it was quite a big deal. And a very pretty little obelisk was found in a Dominican monastery. And and the obelisk any obelisk that was found belonged to the Pope. And the Pope said, gosh, we found this new obelisk. What are we going to do with it? And he commissioned Bernini to come up with an idea for it. And Bernini said, well, actually, I've got this idea because I once saw an illustration of a book. I've got an idea about sculpting. Let's have, obelisks are very heavy and they're very spiritually important, et cetera, et cetera. Let's have an obelisk carried on the back of an elephant, because the elephant is kind of the king of beasts. And it's so strong and so distinctive. It'll make a great support for an obelisk. So Bernini created this design in which he had an elephant standing on a plinth and an obelisk being carried on the elephant's back. And it's a pretty extraordinary work of the imagination. I mean, really incredible. I mean, bizarre in the extreme, but also very, very beautiful, very original, very inventive. And so Bernini, as it were, sold that idea to the Pope. And the Pope said, yeah, I like the sound of that. And it turned out really to be Bernini's last work for Pope Alexander the VII, because and Alexander the VII was very interested in it. He composed very beautiful Latin inscriptions to go around the base of the elephant, et cetera, et cetera. And this was going to be a very personal monument to him. And then very sadly, he just died a few weeks before it was finished. So he never got to see the finished thing, but it's very much a tribute by Bernini of his great friendship with Alexander the VII.
What did Bernini do after this? Did popes after Alexander the VII use him and continue on with these projects? Because oftentimes new people come in, they want to put their own stamp on things, or they want to look like the one who's taking the fiscal reins in.
Yeah. Well, generally, I mean, what was particularly interesting about the papacy is, firstly, the Pope was not only the spiritual leader of the Catholic world, he was also a temporal political, he was a monarch. He had his own country, the Papal States. So he was a secular ruler. But unlike most monarchs who, when they die, a kid inherits it. When the Pope dies, there has to be an election for a new Pope. And the new Pope, of course, has to bring his family to Rome and his friends to Rome and his followers to Rome, and he has to give them all jobs. So anyone who's worked for the previous Pope usually gets tossed onto the scrap heap. Bernini, because he was so important an artist and because popes couldn't do without him, Bernini managed to live through every regime change. And after Alexander the VII died, and by this time Bernini is in 17th century terms an old man because he's like in his late 60s. Nonetheless, subsequent popes still commission him. He does one sort of spectacular work, which is the Ponte Sant'Angelo, the bridge that leads to the Vatican, with 10 huge sculptures of angels. It remains one of the most beautiful bridges in the world and a key site of Rome. So Bernini keeps working until he's nearly 82 and he dies. Bernini does not retire.
To wrap up today, I always love to ask people questions about the process. And reading your book, it's organized in a really interesting way. There's no chapters in the book per se. What was your idea on how you organize this book and put it together? Because you tell a complete story, but it's not in the traditional way that you would read either a nonfiction book or a fiction book.
Well, I guess you could say it's slightly discursive. There are so many elements to the story that it was very hard to, I sort of originally thought about doing it because, being trained very conventionally as a historian, I thought of, there has to be a chronological narrative. But just doing a straightforward chronological narrative just didn't capture all the elements of the story. And I remember that, that French film director, Jean-Luc Godard, said that, every story has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, but not necessarily in that order. And I sort of thought, I've got all this stuff to write about. I've got to figure out a way to put it together. And it seemed that kind of a cross between a chronological approach and a thematic approach was the way that was going to enable me to tell a highly complex story in a way that people who were not specialists could understand.
Well, it's a fascinating book. It's a beautiful book, too. It's one of the most beautiful books I've ever read, with almost every several pages. There's a beautiful color plate to it. So you've done a masterful job.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you so much for your time. If people want to learn more about you and to follow you, like maybe if there's new projects you have coming up, where can we learn a bit more?
I can be found on, there is a website. If you or I'm on Instagram as Loyd Grossman. If you Google me, you'll find the current website.
Yeah, and I'll connect that in the show notes. Do you have any other little projects you might be in the works?
Yes, but at the moment, shrouded in secrecy, but I'll let you know in time.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, and we will definitely be looking forward to those new shrouded projects.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you again for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. Of course, a big thanks goes out to Loyd Grossman, author of The Pope and the Making of the Eternal City. Links to learn more about Loyd Grossman and his book can be found at loyd.grossman.com or in the show notes. A great way to support Beyond the Big Screen is to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. These reviews really help me know what you think about the show and help other people learn about Beyond the Big Screen. You can connect with me and other people who want to learn more about the movies they watch and stories so great that they should be movies on Facebook and Twitter by searching for A2Z History Page. You can contact me there or just send me a good old-fashioned email to steve@a2zhistorypage.com. Links to all this and more can be found at a2zhistorypage.com. I will see you next time beyond the big screen.